This is a question for Amber. Thank you all for wonderful talks, and I've learned an awful lot in the last hour and a half. So this is a question about how the demographics of being plugged into media outlets are distributed, because there's a skew, I assume, in the degree to which different demographics actually are following the news. So that's sort of part A of the question. And part B is, while you say the New York Times and mainstream media is fairly representative, there's now an increasing tendency for people to get their news from the sources whose editorial viewpoint they most agree to. So there's a kind of balkanization. So we have a fractionation of public discourse, because people who agree with each other tend to hang out together. There's a divisiveness because of not crossing those lines in a common forum. And then there are many people who are not plugged in to the news, often because it's so aversive. And for some reason, if you watch the 11 o'clock news before you go to sleep, you don't have good dreams. So could you just comment on all that?
Yeah, well, I guess there are two layers to the answer. And the first one is that these particular patterns that I look at in my book, that media changes over time in this explosive fashion, and then that it's skewed across policy topics, these patterns really do hold across different types of news outlets and specific news outlets. It's just as true for Fox News and MSNBC, and just as true, by the way, for Twitter and for Facebook. There's a different layer to your question, and that is the ideological skew. Is this microphone okay?
Just put it back.
Yeah, I can. There. Yeah.
So if we turn it off until you need it.
Okay. So the second layer to your question is about the ideology. You know what? How about if I just turn it off? The second. Oh, you're recording. Oh, I forgot. I'm sorry. The second layer to your question is about the ideology, and I don't look at that, but I have in other areas, and a lot of scholars have. And you're exactly right that as we increasingly turn to niche news outlets, we increasingly get that ideological signal that we sought out in the first place. And this is very problematic because it means that we get a narrowed view of the world. And of course, people who are younger are less likely to get their news from a traditional source like the New York Times or even like Fox News or MSNBC. They're much more likely to get their news from YouTube and from Twitter and even from Snapchat, right? That's where they get their news. And so they're still going to see this explosive patterns of coverage over time, but they're going to see an even higher degree of skew and more surface level reporting. And so that's a problem. But we're in this really exciting, uncharted territory of media. We're not sure where we're going to land. It's not clear at all. But it's certainly the case that more diversification for all of us would be better, and that the direction of our media marketplace is not facilitating that.
Nicole?
Kim, I have a question for you. Given your studies, have you thought about UC Davis and our identity, and what we might do to be an authentic and high status place?
Yeah. Yes, a lot, and I've talked to several chancellors and provosts about this. Irene, my favorite quote from any of them is from Virginia Hinshaw, who always used to say, "We suffer from Midwest humility, even though we're in California, and that we don't. Our problem is that we just don't blow our horn enough, and so people don't know who we are, because we definitely have our own authentic identity. So the identity of the place is agricultural in historically, but it's also an incredibly diverse institution. We've got 100 majors and 85 departments, and we're more diverse than any of the other UCs, and that comes across pretty clear when you talk to anybody from UC. Our problem is not that we don't have an authentic identity, it's that nobody knows about it. So I think that's where Amber should answer this question, actually. We need to create a media storm around UC Davis in a good way. Because the only media storm that ever happened around us was not good, recently at least. And I think that's our problem. More than that we don't have an identity. It's just nobody knows what it is.
So I'd like to pick up on that very point there. One of the things I'd like to hear Amber talk more about is how public relations or advertising shape media storms. It seems that the second two papers really highlight the deliberate shaping of categories and of ways of thinking about things. And while you were showing about how the media storms shape readers' perceptions, I wonder about kind of the active role of PR or advertising in shaping what becomes a media storm and how that media storm takes shape.
Yeah, well, media storms come in, oh, jeez. I'll get it. Media storms come in a number of different forms. There are big media storms, there are small media storms. The ones that we tend to think of are the ones that relate to news, but we can think of plenty of them that relate to either products or to university campuses. Media storms tend to be negative in nature, and that's because we pay more attention to negative information than to positive information. Allison will talk a lot more about that next session. But yeah, so my read on it is that there are a whole bunch of different factors that are all necessary to produce a media storm, but none of them by itself is sufficient. And so if you think of market people trying to push a product or to push a particular identity of a product, they're going to be able to do that, but that's only going to produce a level of media attention if other things come into play. If it's a slow news cycle, if there's nothing else to talk about, if there's some interesting new twist on it, it has to be new information, it has to be fresh, it has to be surprising. There was a study recently about, you know, if you go to whatever news source you go to, often you can click on what stories not are the top stories, but which stories were most emailed. The most emailed stories tend not to be the biggest stories as we would identify them by nature of the event, but those stories that are most surprising in nature. That's what we pay attention to. And so for people who are trying to market something like a university, that's a tough challenge because part of your identity is being stable and solid. And in order to get a buzz around you, you would have to come up with, I don't know, a new institute, right? And if you do that, then maybe you can get some media play.
I have a question for Kimberly. One of the things, talking about when you identify with a particular company or organization or things like that, is the values they have. And one thing that I've been noticing a lot in recent years is because maybe the internet and you have access to who they're giving donations to, what their values are maybe in their personal life, that starts to come into the company. So you might agree with 80% of what that company stands for, but what is the tipping point of like the one thing that person donated to someone who's against gay marriage, therefore that organization should be boycotted? You see these like knee-jerk reactions going all the time now.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question about what the tipping point is, and my answer is I don't know what the tipping point is, but I do know that it does affect people personally, and I think that it has to reach a certain level of personal significance or salience. One of the studies that I did that relates to this is on the Augusta National Golf Club, which holds the Masters tournament. And a few years ago, there was a big uproar about getting them to have a woman member, and they'd never had a woman member before. And I recall that several very high-profile members who were members of Congress or who were CEOs of big companies said, I gotta help them get a woman member just to get my daughter off my back. And so for these people, the sort of, it became very personal, and it was affecting their home life, and then that was at the point where, you know, they started to pressure the company to do something different. So there clearly is a different point for different people, but that was one example of it became personal.
Hi, this is for Cristina. So I really liked the presentation. In fact, I liked it so much I bought the book. Good book, you should get it and read I don't know her. This is our first time I've ever talked to her.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah. But you know, your thesis is so, which I agree with, is that basically for strategic or mercantile reasons, the Hispanic category was developed, and so I think it has some interesting implications in the following sense. Among Latinos, obviously, the recognition of intergroup differences are pretty clear, and so the differences that kind of get swept away in the Hispanic category are recognized among Latinos, or at least some subset of them. But I guess getting to my question, I wonder if you could talk about the implications of your result for out-group derogation, that is negative stereotyping of Latinos, because you know, the way Latinos are portrayed in the media, well, they're portrayed as Latinos oftentimes. And so this undifferentiated mass, even though there's this differentiation within the community, coupled with the fact that a lot of the media coverage of Latinos and Latino issues is highly negative or negatively framed, it seems like your thesis would have some implications for stereotyping, discrimination towards Latinos. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about that.
Sure, thanks. So in writing the book, I started this book thinking about, I'm from Los Angeles and my parents are of Mexican descent, and I went to grad school on the East Coast, and when I hung around New York or, would go out to Philadelphia, everyone would think I was Puerto Rican. And I started, I'm so different. We're so different. The food is different. The accent is different. Why is this the same category? And I started pondering about this a lot in grad school. And then I thought, well, let's try to figure out how this evolved. And one thing that was always clear is, what I'm talking about is the institutionalization of the category, not necessarily just the construction. There's always been a tendency, perhaps because of the Spanish language, of just saying, sort of grouping as Spanish-speaking. If you look at sort of the earliest articles in the New York Times, for example, it would say sort of the Spanish people. But that didn't mean that meant that Puerto Ricans and Mexicans were getting together to create an agenda. Didn't mean that the Census Bureau was actively considering these groups as part of one. And so I say that to say that I think that what was going on was that this is one way that activists, and in some ways activists that become elites within the community, because over time, the discourse about who Hispanics are within the community becomes taken over by a level of elites, right? Owners of television stations, journalists, people that have the ear of the executive office, things like that. Those are the people that start creating reports on who Latinos are. So on one hand, this becomes almost a way of sort of taking back that homogenization that was sort of in the air already and putting their own narrative to it. So, for example, part of the research, I did a lot of interviews with owners of media stations who were also their own PR persons. There were no independent Latino advertising agencies at the same time. I mean, I remember I did an interview with a newscaster that was the head of Univision News for a very long time, and he said half of my day was trying to create sales, trying to generate sales and things of the sort. And they really had to create a narrative that spinned sort of the positive. And part of the positive, unfortunately, becomes based around money, about what we contribute to the market, who we are. To some extent, it also becomes a narrative about our civic life. Latinos are not these foreigners. Latinos together are people that contribute to the nation, people that raise their families here. So there becomes a sense of, Hispanic Americans. This is an American constituency that tries to combat sort of what had already been there for a long time, sort of the Spanish speaking and sort of this negative aspect. The positive aspect of that is that you get this sort of broad narrative about sort of, if you want to say the good stuff, people that sign up and enlist in the armed forces, people that raise their families here, people that want to learn English, people that have good family values, people that go and buy diapers and contribute to your economy. The offside, the bad part to that is sort of twofold. One is it continues a narrative of lumping everybody together, Even though on an everyday basis I can still go and say, these are all the differences I have with it, why are we still in the same category? The second thing that, that happens and that the book explains is that it tramps down or shuts off a lot of the alternative narratives about, and especially in the 1970s, about nationalism, about sort of Chicano power, about Puerto Rican pride. It tramps down on this because sort of these individualist arguments based on sort of colonialism or oppression get taken away and replaced with these sort of commercial narratives and civic narratives. So it's got its, the positives, but also sort of these negative outcomes as well.
Hello. Okay. It's a little bit loud. Hi, Cristina. I have a question for you as well. I'm of Chilean descent, I guess, well, really born and raised in Chile, and somehow the category of being Latino or Hispanic became true for people like me when you actually cross the border. So I'm wondering more, my question is more connected to self-identification, because with other friends from different nationalities or that were born and raised in the United States, there's this idea of like, do you identify yourself as Hispanic or do you identify yourself as Latino? Do you see any differences among the communities in terms of which label we ascribe to and what might be the reasons behind that? For example, as a Chilean, it's really hard for us to identify, for some of us, as Latinos because we see it as more of a Central American kind of hot weather kind of thing. And it's really cold in Chile, so it's a little bit different right there. So I'm wondering about what your research shows about why we choose one label or another among the different communities.
So one of my big arguments is that Hispanic is by nature ambiguous, so is Latino, ambiguous by nature. And they made it this way in order so that they could encompass so much diversity, not only of the people, but more importantly, of the interests involved, right? If you were going to say there were consumers and you had to sort of make this fit with an argument also about their disadvantage and sort of you bubble it up by pointing to culture. When they were discussing or deciding about labels, it really was just a matter of elimination. It was almost as if there were several meetings at the Census Bureau about whether we would pick Hispanic or Latino. Latino in many ways sort of sounded to many people at the table as still foreign because still Latin American. And this was part of an agenda of making Hispanic seem like as an American constituency, like African Americans, things like that. And so, but if you're not sort of creating an exact definition, what happens is you still have all these sort of labels that can still come into play. And I think about with individual identification, one of the biggest factors is not necessarily, to some extent, nationality, but one of the bigger things is sort of urbanness. So in urban areas, we're more likely to use phrases like Latino versus Hispanic. In rural areas, especially around Texas, New Mexico, things like that, Hispanic runs the day. Most people, though, will tell you when they run surveys, and now these surveys are all much more contemporary. I mean, first you have to create the category, then you ask people if they like it or not, right? So we don't have the first surveys about whether people like the category until the early 1990s, and this stuff was happening in the 70s. Most people display no difference or no preference, right? I'm sure if you sort of sliced it up by, cultural capital or SES as well, you'd probably see academics on the Latino side, depending on sort of these academic arguments about the role of Hispanic culture. But for the most part, there's no preference, which speaks to me a lot more about the ambiguity. Most people don't have a preference, and they don't even know the difference, and they'll go between one and the other. In fact, this is so prominent that organizations then capitalized on this. So in the early 1990s, the activist groups that had been at the table, had lobbied for Hispanic, had called themselves Hispanic, suddenly started going in and redlining their mission statements, and instead of just sort of putting, we represent the Hispanic people, they would say, we represent the Hispanic/Latino people, right, in order to capture on this. But I think the difference is still sort of ambiguous and part of sort of small pocket discussions.
Thanks very much. I have a question for Amber, which is about And I think it goes back to one of the very first questions, which is about how your model might kind of deal with the political economy or institutional architecture of the media landscape today, and also the kind of the background political context that it kind of feeds into. And I'm thinking of two things that are related. One is the kind of the slow death of investigative journalism. You talk a lot about the New York Times, but from my understanding, the New York Times is really the only one with the resources to actually do that sort of in-depth journalism. I'm thinking at the moment they're doing some very interesting stuff for the Clinton Foundation. And what the architecture does is to actually, only one outlet can actually really do that sort of investigative journalism. Most of the time it's just kind of idle talk that gets recirculated via Twitter and things. And the second thing that I wondered whether your model can capture is the political leanings of these things. So we know that the New York Times is lefty, Twitter is full of academics who are also sort of naturally lefty, so it's not for nothing that Ferguson is the one that kind of gets so much play. And also going back to the investigative journalism, it popped to mind that Woodward and Bernstein were Washington Post reporters. And from my understanding, the Washington Post even doesn't do that sort of investigative journalism anymore. So I just wondered how that kind of plays in, or if it kind of is a separate issue.
Yeah, the institutional structure of the media system and the media marketplace and how individual news outlets operate, that's exactly why we should be concerned about the slow death or maybe quick death of investigative journalism, but also why I think that we shouldn't be so concerned. I think that maybe by accident it will be saved, and here's why. So my understanding is that I know it seems like it's an endangered species, and certainly it is, but the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and even the SAC-B continues to designate some portion of their resources toward investigative journalism. It's a narrowing portion of resources. We would, of course, want it to be bigger, but we still have many news outlets across the country and even some online sources, right? If you look at the Huffington Post and Politico, a lot of the stories that you get are going to be just those echo chamber stories that are bounced around, but some stories you're going to get are going to be because a reporter decided to look at something and to dig deep, even if there wasn't some particular event to look at. There's a classic example in a policy in California where we have required for years, just up until a couple of years ago, to put flame retardants into our furniture and our baby clothes. The Chicago Tribune hung on to this story and did this deep investigative report on it, and it was just mind-blowing in how the chemical company and big tobacco, if you can believe it, had really pushed this policy that then affected the level of flame retardants and thus the chemicals in our body across the country. This investigative journalism, my point is still happening. We're maybe removed from it because we are more likely to get our news in quick data bites on our phones, right? So again, not to put blame, but the consumers are really driving the investigative journalists to pay more of their attention to shorter stories. But here's why I think we really shouldn't be as concerned as we might be. I'm very concerned, but it's because the nature of this dynamic reporting that I've talked about, this hybrid model where news outlets, even small resource news outlets online, will lurch into covering some alarm item, but then in those rare cases will shift into that watchdog mode. In that case, you've got news outlets all across the country reporting on things, and they're reporting on it in this echo chamber kind of fashion. But at some point, the public is going to get bored of hearing the same things day after day, and so just by virtue of having to come up with something new to think about on the issue, we're going to get, maybe even by accident, reporters who normally do service level reporting having to dig down deep and give us more information. The separate question is one of ideology, and that really is concerning. You're right that every newspaper has a slant, and every TV source, including the New York Times, although it's I mean, objectively it's not as bad as we might think. But the real problem, again, is with the consumer relationship now to this interactive media. It's not only that we tend to pick whatever single news source is going to give us the view of the world, the view of reality that we want it to give us, but it's also that when you go on to Facebook, for example, there's something called a filter bubble, where you don't get all your news feed in chronological order. You get it ranked by the number of times you've liked similar news reports from that friend before. The same thing happens when you do a Google search. And so these algorithms have tailored themselves towards making our lives more convenient, towards getting us more quickly to the type of news that we want. That means that our interactive process is meaning that we're increasingly getting not just a narrowed number of stories about a few issues, but about a few issues presented in the way that we want to see the world. So read more diverse stories, including newspapers.
We have time for another one or two questions.
Hi. I'm interested in the way that the language that we use shapes the issues. And, you know, this is kind of implicit in all of the presentations. But I'm thinking about it especially in terms of news media. And, for example, the way that the emergence of the theme or even just the term of income inequality has suddenly allowed us to talk about something that we really have not been talking very much about. And I sort of saw this peak with Piketty's book, and then people pulling some very in-depth journalism and very interesting editorial pieces, and some people really repeating that over. I mean, Paul Krugman, for example, has taken this on as a theme of his editorials, and not to say that the term income inequality hasn't existed for a very long time, but just the prominence of it in Piketty's book seems to have made this explosion happen. And I mean, it's not a media storm in quite the sense you were using it with these huge stories, but I think it has persisted for a very long time now.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, again, there are a number of different factors that have made that possible, and it's hard to point to any single one, but I think that the discussion of income inequality when we had the Romney-Obama campaign in 2012, that helped to soften the ground for us all to think about income distribution. And then we have had this push of the raising of the floor of minimum wage, which has been really interesting, and that's probably only been made possible by the recovering economy. And so I think a lot of the stage has to be set for some kind of conversation like that to happen, and there needs to be nothing else dramatic that is pulling our attention away. So the question is, during this brief window of time when we have the bandwidth, the mental bandwidth and the media bandwidth to think about income inequality, how are there policies that'll be pushed through? That makes it, that gives room for news coverage of, for example, this Silicon Valley organization that just decided to give, $70,000 salaries to everyone across the board, no matter who you were. That gets media attention because we've already been talking about it, because the public is primed to think about this, and because thankfully, there aren't any current natural disasters in the U.S. to pay attention to instead.
Okay, we're going to have to break now.
Yeah, so we'll have a 15-minute break in the library, and thank you to the panelists.